Hey YouTubers, this is Cunny Guy here with a short video on resizing 284 Winchester brass for 7.5 Swiss. I just purchased a Swiss K31 this past week and started doing my research on reloading for the Swiss K31 and came across a lot of information on resizing 284 Winchester brass for the 7.5 by 55 Swiss. Now, if you start doing your research, you'll probably find that the Swiss K31 brass, or the 7.5 by 55, is fairly expensive. Online, I noted that the brass was going for in excess of $1, probably $1.26 or somewhere around there for a cartridge, and Winchester brass was going for about a third of that. Now, that's if you can actually find Swiss brass or Winchester brass online. I wasn't able to find anything in stock, but I was able to find brass here locally, and the prices did not really, I guess, reflect what I found on the internet, but nevertheless, the Swiss brass was still more expensive than the Winchester. Here you can see here the price of the Swiss brass that I purchased was $17 for 20 brass cases. That's roughly 86 cents a case. The Winchester brass here is about $13 for 20, so roughly half of the costs. Not necessarily half, but a lot cheaper than the Swiss if you buy it in bulk. I think on the internet you'll find a greater difference between the cost of the Winchester brass and the Swiss brass, and therefore it makes sense to resize 284 brass if you can get it to work. As you notice, the cases are almost identical in dimensions. The Swiss brass accepts a 308 bullet diameter, whereas the Winchester significantly less. So what you'll end up having to do is to resize it so that the mouth of the case accepts a 308 bullet. Pretty straightforward process if you have resized cases before. I ended up purchasing a Lee set of dies. I know Reading dies have been I guess, sought after dies for this purpose, but the literature out there indicates that you can do the same job with Lee dies at probably half the cost. So I gave it a shot. I picked up some Lee dies and gave it a shot here. Now, a couple of pointers. When you resize the 284 Winchester brass for the Swiss 7.5 by 55, what you really want to do is lubricate the case very well, and that's on the outside of the case, and especially the shoulder area right here, because this area right here will get reworked. And what I did before I actually began the resizing process is I annealed the cases. Some literature out there indicates that the cases are already annealed so that when the brass is formed, the mouth of the cases don't split. But there was no indication that at least the 284 Winchester brass was annealed, so I went ahead and I annealed the brass there just for good measure. As I mentioned a little earlier, you want to lubricate the outside of the case very well, and I use the lubrication system from Lee, diluted in alcohol. And the second thing that you ought to do is lubricate the insides of the mouth of the case extremely well, because what's going to happen is once you put it through the sizer, it's going to stretch the mouth of the case, and if the sizing die get stuck in that case, you'll end up crushing the case, and you'll end up with something that looks like this. Now this case is destroyed, but this just serves as an example of what will happen if the die gets hung up in the sizing die and the mouth is pushed down and crushed into the body of the case. So I got 2 of those before I realized that I wasn't lubricating the mouth of the case sufficiently. So you end up with 2 wasted brass here. But that's how you learn, I guess. So lubricate the outsides of the case and lubricate the insides. I use graphite lubrication on the inside, right? And in order to make sure that the cases were well lubed, I ended up using a silicone spray. I just sprayed this onto a paper towel and used my fingertips, and I just coated the outside of the case here just for good measure. And you'll be able to tell whether it's working or not, because as you resize that brass, the effort going into moving that lever will be significantly reduced. Okay, so the trick to resizing 284 Winchester brass on the Lee die is to make sure that the resizing die actually touches the shell holder. If you follow the normal process for resizing brass, they'll tell you to bring the ram all the way up, turn the die down so that it touches the case, and then you back down the ram, and perhaps you turn it just a quarter turn, just for good measure. Well, the brass tends to stretch as you resize it, so even if you set the die according to the way Lee specifies in its instructions, what you find is that at the top of the ram, as you're resizing the 284 Winchester brass, the bottom of the die will not touch the case holder. So you actually have to turn the die slightly more, perhaps another quarter turn to another half turn. And that's important because the last part of the stroke is actually what sets back the shoulder of the case. All right. So again, what you want to do is turn the die until you touch the shell holder, back down the ram, and then turn it probably a half turn more. The technique that I used to make sure that this 284 Winchester brass actually cycled through my K31 is to put a resized K31 into the chamber and to push the bolt forward. And if the bolt goes all the way forward with very little effort, then you know at least the brass will actually fit. Now, if the die is not tightened down sufficiently, the bolt won't close easily. You'll have to push it really hard, and that's not what you want to do. So again, a really simple process. I've destroyed just 2 cases out of the 60 that I just did, and that was because of user error and not lubricating the cases sufficiently. So I hope this helps. You can save yourself some money by resizing 284 Winchester brass. From what I understand, the brass is thicker, a little more hardy than the 7.5 by 55 Swiss cases. So what that translates to is longer case life and more shots out of this particular brass 284 Winchester than the 7.5 by 55 Swiss. Okay, what I wanted to show you here is what I was talking a little bit about earlier. When you're resizing the Winchester 284 brass, or the 284 Winchester I should say, and you want to check to make sure that it'll chamber properly, what you do is you take a resized brass and you put it in the chamber here. And what you want to do is close the boat you also want to pull out the caulking ring so that it's out of the slot here. So normally it's in this position, the firing position, and to put it to the safe position you'd pull out the caulking ring and turn it this way. So what you want to do is actually pull it out and put it midway. And so when you've got the brass, the resized brass in the chamber, and you're testing to see if it chambers properly, you want to push the bolt closed very gently. Now, if it's not sized properly, you'll get about to this point and it won't go any further without great effort. You should be able to just close it with 2 fingers pushing gently forward, and you'll see it, the bolt close, and of course the serial number will be up as it should be when it's properly chambered. So the first couple of brass that I resized, I didn't have the die turned down enough, so what happened was the brass would get stuck right about there and it wouldn't lock. And then I took the brass out, turned the die down just another quarter turn, resized it, stuck it back in the chamber, did the same thing, and the bolt closed easily. Okay? So that's how you basically test the brass that you resize to make sure that it'll fit in the chamber here.